Hello and welcome to Symbolic Studies. My name is Mario, and you are watching Symbolic Secrets. This is the series where I dive deep into a specific symbol, myth, or in this case, a tarot card. And we've got a really good one today because I feel like I have a unique relationship with the fourth card of the Major Arcana, which is the Emperor. Can't wait to get into it with you guys. But before we do, just a reminder, for all things Symbolic Studies, you can visit symbolicstudies.com. All right, so let's talk about the Marseille version of the card to kick things off today. And what do we see? We see what looks like a king or a lord or an emperor. And I'm going to actually use king and lord synonymously with emperor. There are differences, but there's more similarities than not. And so this is, of course, the Emperor card. He is throned. This is very interesting if you've been following the series up until this point, because I've been emphasizing the nature of these throned figures because it's fascinating to me. The High Priestess is throned, the Empress is throned, the Emperor is throned, and then even the Hierophant, the fifth card of the Major Arcana, is throned. And so what I've been saying up until this point is that the throne actually relates to the queen. So when you see a king or a lord on a throne, to me, they're more so emulating the queen. They're mirroring her power. They're mirroring her dynamic, which is to be more receptive. To be sitting down is more receptive. To be walking or traveling or upright, that would be more masculine. That would be a little bit more projective, in my opinion. So he is throned. It's not uncommon for the emperor to be holding a wand. Oftentimes, at the end of the wand, there is that globus cruciger, which is the sphere with the cross on top of it. It's also not uncommon for the emperor to be holding his waistline, right? To be holding a belt or something along these lines, which I think is very interesting. I think there's a few different ways of interpreting that. That's not something that I'm going to be getting into in this episode, but I do think it's worth noting at the very least. It's not uncommon for the emperor to also have a shield. Oftentimes there is an eagle there. This shield is also seen in the Empress card as well. So there is that dynamic between them as well. Clearly there's the Empress card and then there's the Emperor, right? And so they're supposed to be looked at as a pair. The number 4 is fascinating. We'll be diving into that towards the later half of this episode here. But let's take a look at the Thoth version. So here we have it from 1943. A very unique take on the Emperor, mostly because things are a little bit more abstract. Obviously, that palette really pops, right? So the orange and the yellows and things like that. It's very eye-catching in that regard. He looks like a formidable sort of man. He has broader shoulders. It looks like he was perhaps maybe a warrior or something along these lines, which makes perfect sense because this card corresponds with Aries. Aries is ruled by Mars, and so there is a Mars warlike energy. Clearly that comes along with this card. You see even the 2 rams on either side of the Emperor. His wand also has that ram head at the very end of it. Rams are full of testosterone. Rams butt heads. The most iconic thing about the ram is its horns, and so the ram is known for butting heads with other rams and basically fighting for dominance and fighting for mating rights, essentially. And so there's a lot of fiery energy with the ram, and obviously Aries too is a cardinal fire sign, so that means that there's more of an explosive sort of energy, I would say, that comes along with this sign. And so no doubt he is, a general as well. He's a warrior. He's someone that has been in the field. He's had his boots on the ground, if you will. And then he also has that globus cruciger that he's holding in his left hand. You see that lamb down below. That's very interesting as well because this card has a lot to do with Christ symbolism. The idea of a sacrificial lamb is definitely in play. Obviously, the ram is related to the lamb. Lamb is just a baby ram. And so there's this innocence and there's this purity there as well. And so the idea behind the sacrificial lamb is that the more sort of pure and innocent a sacrifice, the more potent that sacrifice is. And so there's a lot of symbolism actually with the king being sacrificed as well. And because we're talking about Aries season, it's worth mentioning that, Julius Caesar, as an example, he was sacrificed or assassinated during Aries season. Christ was crucified during Aries season. Aries season is the time of war. There's a lot of wars traditionally that have begun, massive, huge wars that have begun during Aries season. And so Aries has been looked at as kind of the sacrificial lamb of the zodiac in a way, in that it's almost like kind of like fire, actually, is a really good metaphor. In order for fire to thrive, something needs to burn. There needs to be some sort of fuel. And so the king has been viewed as this sort of sacrificial fuel. The lamb has been viewed as this sacrificial fuel. Wood is obviously used for fire to make fire. And so that's kind of in play as well. So there's a lot of different storylines and myths and historical events that have to do with the sacrifice of the king or the killing of the king. Some people have referred to this as the killing of the king ritual. And so that is very interesting as well, as it relates to Mars, as it relates to war, and all of these different types of things. You'll see that he also has a shield there with the double-headed eagle. And of course, there's many other things we can decode and break down with this card because it is really a dynamic card for so many different reasons. But let's proceed here to another version of the card, which would be the Rider-Waite from 1909. And for the record, this is probably my favorite version of this card. Once again, the Rider-Waite really is becoming my favorite deck of all time, which I never thought I would say because earlier on I just felt like it was a little generic, but I think it was just my symbolic awareness was lacking. But now that it's more up to speed, I see things that I really, really appreciate. And so you see the emperor sitting in his throne. It's a very powerful throne as well. It's made out of stone. You see that long white beard, right? So he's been through things. He's had experiences. He's a veteran of sorts, right? He has that globe in one hand and then an interesting wand in the other hand. This style of wand is pretty interesting because it looks like it's sort of an ankh, in my opinion, or it looks like it might be related to the Venus glyph. I see the Venus glyph and the ankh being very much related to each other as well. But you have the cross, which oftentimes relates to Earth. It looks like a T, right, with a circle on top. The T is also known as a Tau cross, so there's a natural correspondence between the letter T and the cross itself. And so to me, I see this as sort of a fusion of heaven and earth in so many different ways, right? But I just think that it's at the very least worth noting, his wand there. Obviously, there's ram skulls or ram heads on the throne as well, clearly because the Emperor card corresponds with Aries. And then his leg is exposed as well, right? So his left leg is a little exposed. And I just think it's really interesting leg symbolism. Paying attention to the legs, right, can convey actually a lot of different information. And so it almost looks like he is ready to kind of get up and go or to do things and travel. I didn't point it out, but in the Thoth deck, his legs are actually crossed. And Aleister Crowley himself has mentioned that this is actually supposed to be a representation of the glyph for sulfur. So I'll put that in here right now. And you can kind of see, obviously, that there is a relationship between the Emperor, his legs, and the glyph for sulfur. It also makes a number 4. That's something else people have pointed out, which I think is interesting because obviously we're dealing with the 4th card of the Major Arcana. And then also you'll see that in the Marseille version from 1709, his legs are also crossed. It's pretty interesting that we're dealing with the number 4, and the number 4 has a relationship with the cross, and then he has crossed legs. And then, of course, there's that cross on top of the sphere there. So very interesting stuff. The cross is definitely in play with this card, and we will be diving deep into that in just a moment here. But one thing I wanted to mention in the first half of this episode today is that there are a lot of classic cards that show a very effeminate emperor, and we're going to be going through some of these. And even when you look at some of the cards that I've already gone through, there are details, there's little subtle hints that this emperor actually has a feminine dynamic to him. There's a feminine quality to him. And Rene Guénon put it very well, but he said that when you really start studying symbolism, you'll find that oftentimes you can find the yang within the yin and the yin within the yang. And when I first heard this, a lot of things clicked for me because I've noticed this for years in a lot of different cards. As an example, in the Strength card, you have a lion that looks very submissive and subdued, but is the lion not the king of the jungle, right? He corresponds with the sun, and he's known for being a very, very powerful animal. Yet in that card, he's being subdued by a woman. And so isn't that kind of interesting? The tarot has this really fascinating way of giving you contrasting symbolism from what you would traditionally expect. So with the Emperor, you would expect more testosterone than anything else. But when you look at classic cards, you'll see, once again, very, very effeminate versions of this figure. So here's the Emperor from the Neoclassical deck. And what do you have here? You have what looks like a very feminine Emperor. You have his hand on his hip there. It's kind of limp-wristed, right? He is basically standing on one foot. It looks like he's standing on his tippy toes. To me, I've talked about this before, especially in the Magician card episode. Standing on your tippy toes, that's not unlike a ballerina. That's very mercurial, but Mercury is also known as the divine androgyne, so he blends masculine and feminine. And then you have that broken pillar on the left. The broken pillar, or the fallen pillar, is very, very feminine. I've talked about this in other presentations. The symbolic meaning behind the broken pillar, the symbolic value of it. And I see it as relating to chaos. The upright pillar is more so related to order. Chaos is more so related to the goddess, in my opinion. And there's so many things to talk about with that. So to have a broken pillar is definitely more so related to feminine symbolism. You will see a broken pillar with the Weeping Virgin motif as well, which I'll put up right here. And so it's always classic that you see the Weeping Virgin, which she very much relates to Virgo, and she's always standing right next to a broken pillar. Again, the complete, upright, vertical, erect pillar is more so masculine. It's more phallic that way. So everything here is implying a feminine nature, a feminine quality. It doesn't look like he's about to go to battle or to go to war. Even his helmet, in my opinion, what looks like feather plumes, it almost kind of looks like it's supposed to be hair, the hair of a woman. Something along these lines. It softens him up, basically. And so I think that is very, very interesting that things are kind of being portrayed this way. It's also very subtle, but notice the wand that he's holding. It's kind of capped with his hand, right? If the wand actually were more upright and vertical, it would be more masculine. It would be more projective, right? But both ends are kind of stunted, right? Both ends are kind of capped. One end with his hand and then the other end with his body. Symbolically, this is actually a reduction of power. This is kind of power being stifled, in my opinion. And it's leaning just like that pillar. So they're making the symbolic relationship between this fallen pillar, notice the angle, and then also this wand. Once again, notice the angle. And so it's almost like the phallus being thwarted or the phallus being reduced in power. That's how I see it personally. And here's another version of the Emperor card. This one's pretty interesting for a few different reasons. Notably, he's in the heavens. You see the eagle right next to him. The eagle, a lot of times, is a reference to Zeus or Jupiter. And Jupiter has a lot to do with the Emperor card as well. I think the sort of more clear, common correspondence is obviously Mars being related to this card, but Jupiter is right there in the mix for a few different reasons. Jupiter being the king of the planets, you can see that there's that sort of clear relationship with the king here or the emperor here and the king of the planets. Jupiter also being a fiery, large planet as well. It makes a lot of sense that Zeus or things related to Jupiter would be in play here. But the main thing I want to point out, which I think is really fascinating, is the fact that he's holding a small woman in his left hand. So what's that all about? Well, I will show you right here. You may be interested to know that traditionally, the figure that's holding a small person in their hand is actually a queen. Generally, it's Isis. And so this is the Dendera zodiac on the right-hand side. You can clearly see Isis holding Horus in her hand. And this is actually a constellation known as Coma Berenices. This is the old version of Coma Berenices. Nowadays, what you see generally is actually a head of hair. It kind of looks like a wig. But way back when, you actually used to see a queen on her throne, and she would have her child in her hand. This is not unlike Mary holding Christ, as an example. So what I'm trying to say is that this is a very feminine classic motif, yet we have the emperor here basically doing the same thing, except instead of holding a small boy or a young child, he's holding a woman with the crown. To me, this is very, very intriguing, but I see this as mirroring the symbolic energy of the queen. I see this as mirroring queen symbolism through and through. And so I'll show you even an example of something I saw when I was in England. So right outside Buckingham Palace, there's a bunch of statues in the middle of this roundabout, essentially, and there's a huge Queen Victoria. She's actually fairly high up there. And when I was there, I noticed that there was something in her hand, and she was holding the classic globe that you see. Generally, what you see, by the way, is when you see a king or a queen holding a globe, they usually contrast that with a wand as well. Otherwise, they usually hold the globus cruciger, right? The globe with the cross on top of it. But when I was looking at the globe, I saw a little figure, and I'm like, what is that? And I searched around online, and I was able to find this photo, and it's a little man. And I think perhaps it's relating to Mercury. Maybe there's something very specific about this figure. I'm not sure. But it really reminded me of Coma Berenices. It really reminded me of Isis with the child in her hand. And so we're dealing with the queen, right? So queen symbolism and goddess symbolism are largely synonymous. And so you will find that there's a lot of overlap between how the queen presents herself and how the goddess also presents herself, right? So I thought this was worth mentioning for obvious reasons that Queen Victoria or her people or her sculptors understood this symbolism and had that little man in her left hand there on top of the globe. So this is Isis with Horus, and you can see that the symbolism to me is largely the same. It's a queen on top of her throne, and she's holding her child. Whether the child is in her lap or the child is in her hand, I see these as largely being very, very similar. And even I would say this symbolism extends over to Virgo. Virgo oftentimes is holding a palm branch. Instead of holding a child, she's holding a substitute in this branch. And Christ is known as the branch as well. Virgo just relates to the Virgin Mary. So this is no different as well from the Virgin Mary just holding Christ, her son. So that's what I tend to see with the symbolism. And so when you see the emperor holding now this woman, I think it's intriguing. I think that he's basically emulating the queen and her dynamic. So once again, finding the yin in the yang and the yang in the yin. Because we're talking about Jupiter, and because Jupiter is relevant with this card, I thought it was worth putting in this card of Jupiter. And you see here Jupiter in the middle of this Vesca Pisces. The Vesca Pisces essentially is a symbol of the yoni, right? It's a gateway, a very, very, very feminine symbol. And he's right there in the middle of it. And so his hand is also right there next to his belt line as well. And so, as I mentioned earlier, this is something that you'll find in the Emperor card. And so I think that it makes a lot of sense to look at the Emperor, notice the feminine symbolism. And I think this makes sense for all the cards, by the way. So I would encourage you, when you're looking through the major arcana, when you're studying the card, if it's a very, very feminine card, look for the masculine symbolism because you're going to find it. If there's a very masculine card, look for the feminine symbolism because you're going to find it. You will find opposing dynamics in the card. And to me, this is actually one of the more brilliant things about the tarot. And once you know that it works like that, you're going to see it all over the place. Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying this episode of Symbolic Secrets so far. If you'd like to support the channel and have full access to this series, which currently has 13 episodes, please consider becoming a member on my website or on Patreon. You'll receive early access to the Symbolic Studies podcast as well. Membership is just $5 a month. It would be greatly appreciated if you get something out of my work. I put a lot of effort into these presentations and have a feeling you'll love the entire series if you like what you're seeing here. Back to the Emperor card. All right, so with all of that said, that kind of concludes the first section of this presentation. I really wanted to talk about the feminine nature of the Emperor because I don't think it's as understood or known as perhaps it should be. As I mentioned, finding the yin in the yang and the yang within the yin is something that you can do throughout the tarot, and I really suggest that you do that because you're going to see the full breadth of the symbolism that way. This next section I think is probably best started with a few references. There's several books that immediately come to mind that I wanted to talk about before we got into the weeds here. The first book is The Lord of the World by Rene Guénon. He talks about Lord symbolism, the dynamic of the king or the emperor, right? Which he refers to in this version as Lord. You're going to find certain releases of this book called The King of the World as well. That's more of the modern version, but originally it was translated as Lord. And he talks about where king symbolism actually came from. And I got a lot out of it. And when I was reading it, I couldn't not think about the Emperor card. And so I'm really excited to get into some of what he said today. I also want to refer people to his book, Symbolism of the Cross. Once again, the Emperor relates very strongly to the cross and to the number 4, as we'll see. And this is one of the deepest books just about the cross, the metaphysics of the cross, what it's meant throughout history, and a lot of mathematics too, pertaining to the cross and why it means what it does. The Great Triad by Rene Guénon is another book that I highly recommend and is really in play here as well, as we'll see. Lastly, I have At the Center of the World by John Michel. The tagline for this book is Polar Symbolism Discovered in Celtic, Norse, and Other Ritualized Landscapes. And he really goes through a slew of different examples of locations around the world, predominantly Europe, where people believe that that specific location was the center of everything, right? So as the title of the book suggests, at the center of the world. And there's a number of these locations throughout the whole entire world, right? And people have different myths associated with these locations. Oftentimes there's a central totem of some sort, whether it's a stone or a tree or something along these lines, a temple. And he goes through all of these different examples, and there's a lot of overlap between these locations with how they were named, how they were sort of designed and structured, how people got there. These locations oftentimes were pilgrimage sites as well that people would return to at some point in their life. And so it's really, really fascinating, but it plays into everything we're going to be unfolding here with the Emperor card, because the Emperor symbolically rules from a central location. So that is going to be the focus for the second half here. And where is this central location? Well, we will talk about it. So the first thing I wanted to point out here in regards to the symbolic location that the Emperor rules from, where the location of his throne actually is, has to do with the fleur-de-lis. The fleur-de-lis, it's actually not uncommon to be associated with the Emperor. And so here in the Thoth deck, you see actually 2 fleur-de-lis down below. You see one in the shadows, and then you see one in the light. This is contrasting the 2 rams, one in the shadows, and then another one in the light. I see this as perhaps being the dualistic nature of the Emperor, right? Every card has its light side and has its shadow side. The Righteous Emperor, as an example, is a builder. He's a stabilizer. He brings things to the table. He protects his people. He has his people's best interest in mind. He doesn't take advantage of them. In his darkest aspects, he's tyrannical, right? And so he's blind with his own power. Things of that sort. So I see that kind of being played out in this card in a couple of different ways with the contrast of shadow and light, which you can easily overlook in this card as well. But you have these 2 fleur-de-lis here, and you see this repeated in a number of Emperor cards. So here's another example. This is the Barbara Walker deck, And Barbara Walker is an amazing symbologist, and here she included two different examples of the fleur-de-lis as well. And once again, you're seeing this kind of contrasting nature between them. One is red and the other is yellow. You see the red one at the end of his wand, and then you see the yellow one on the top of his hat here. And the fleur-de-lis has been something that I've been interested in for a number of years. And I feel as though perhaps one of the quickest ways to understand its true power and its true nature is to, of all things, look at old compasses and look at old compass roses. So here's an old compass rose, right? You see that rose right there in the middle. You see north, south, east, and west. And you see one fleur-de-lis here. And where is it pointed? It's pointed north. When I first found this out, it really blew my mind. And then I found a bunch of different examples of this. So here's another such example. A compass rose, and then you see that large fleur-de-lis up top, right? So it's pointing north. Here's another example from an old map with two different compass roses on it. You'll see that in each case, the northern arrow, once again, has a fleur-de-lis attached to it. Here's an older compass, and you'll see once again at the northern point, a fleur-de-lis. In fact, there's not even an N here for north. There's just a fleur-de-lis. Isn't that interesting and isn't that fascinating? All compasses point where? They point north. And I see the compass pointing north not only as a sort of physical instrument that you can use for navigation, but I see this as actually a metaphysical, spiritual thing as well. You know, your north, your true north. The North Star is the guiding star. The North Star was the preeminent star in sea navigation. So if you knew where the North Star was, you knew what direction you were going in, right? So Northern symbolism, as you guys know by now, is near and dear to my heart. And so the fleur-de-lis actually has a northern correspondence, which is really, really intriguing. And by the way, I'm like glossing over fleur-de-lis symbolism and its implications and what it means. There's a very sacred feminine aspect to the fleur-de-lis as well that I'm not really addressing here. But I did a presentation on my live tab. And if you look for this thumbnail, you'll see all of my insights regarding the fleur-de-lis because it really is a very, very potent symbol. There's a lot of intriguing things as it relates to France and the esoteric nature of France, the different orders that are associated with France. There's a connection to the Black Madonna and the fleur-de-lis. There's all sorts of things kind of going on there, but you'll find more of my sort of expanded take on this symbol if you check out this live stream. Nonetheless, you'll find that the fleur-de-lis has a relationship to the north, and as it relates to compasses, it's really interesting with the fact that all compasses point north. There's this old idea that there is a magnetic stone or a magnetic mountain in the northernmost portion of Earth. Sometimes it's referred to as the World Mountain or the Lodestone. The North Star is sometimes referred to as the Lodestar because there's this natural relationship with the North Pole and the northern sky as well. And what do you see here in the Mercator map? You see a northern mountain, a polar mountain, and from it emanate 4 rivers. This is a classic theme with northern symbology or polar symbology, is that there's said to be 4 rivers that emanate from this mountain, or 4 winds that emanate from this mountain. You could also say that this is a symbolic representation of the 4 cardinal directions, a symbolic north, south, east, and west, that all are expressed from this central location. This central location being related to a mountain relates to a number of other world mountain concepts. And the mountain itself bridges the gap between heaven and earth, right? And so you climb a mountain, you get closer to the heavens. And so the mountain is kind of like a symbolic pole or a column or a pillar that acts as sort of a stairway to other realms, if you will. And so this is another idea that has long been associated with the North and polar symbolism, is that there is a gateway to other domains from this location. So naturally, when we're talking about the 4 cardinal directions, we think of north, south, east, and west, and therefore we think of a cross, right? And so here's just a very simple cross indicating north, south, east, and west. There's 4 quarters or 4 quadrants with this cross. There's the 4 arms. And obviously, this relates to the number 4 as well, right? And the cross itself, whether it's square like this or a little bit taller, naturally relates to the number 4. And so here we have the number 4 itself. I've already mentioned the 4 because of the Emperor card and because of the crossed legs, right? Even again, the cross and literally crossing over. And the Jupiter glyph also looks like the number 4. Isn't that interesting? I've brought up Jupiter a number of times now. And when you look at the glyph itself, it has this relationship to the number 4. Once again, Jupiter is the king of planets. And Christ was known as the King of Kings, and he's associated with the cross. He was crucified, so he was nailed to a cross. The symbolic relationship between Christ and the cross is extraordinarily deep. Yes, there's 4 quadrants. Yes, there's 4 arms. But there actually is a sacred center to the cross, and it's where the vertical axis meets the horizontal axis. So this is actually the hidden 5th element. This is the 5th point in the cross. And so that is the point of transcendence. So the cross in and of itself literally represents ascension. It represents crossing over, which is why you're going to see it in cemeteries all over the world. All you have to do is get a branch, tie it with another branch, and then now you have a cross. Obviously, it looks like these crosses are made out of marble or something along these lines. But the cross represents crossing over, and the most potent portion of the cross is once again where the vertical axis meets the horizontal axis, because that is the point of transcendence. That is the 5th point. It relates to the number 5. So all crosses, all squares have a hidden relationship with the middle point where they meet. And so this would be the location of that polar mountain, in the middle of the 4 rivers, in the middle of the 4 cardinal directions, or in the middle of where the 4 winds emanate. So I found this dynamic to be so interesting that I actually did a live stream with a friend called Kingdoms, Kings, and Crosses. It's still on my live tab if you want to watch it. And I've always intended to redo it, but you can see here all of the elements that I'm talking about. You see the mountain, the symbolic central mountain or polar mountain. You can see that I put the cross inside of the O there in crosses. There is a relationship between kingdoms being divided into 4 from a central location, kings relating to the number 4 as I'm building upon, and then of course the cross is related to the number 4 as well. And all of these things really come together in the Emperor card. So here I have a cross, and you can see that I've highlighted the middle there with that white dot. This corresponds, this point of transition, this point of pivot as it relates to the cross, relates to the number 5. The number 5 is fascinating because it seems to be a bridge between the physical and the spiritual. That's why there's so many mystical things related to the pentacle or the pentagram, right? Also, I'll say that this central point is no different than your sacred center. So you commune with the cosmos by going within to your center, to that still point within. To me, you get there by being present. And I see it as the middle point being sort of the middle of the wheel, the middle of your wheel as well. So it's being in the middle of the wheel where the axle is. And so there's a relationship with the polar mountain and the North Star, the polar star, being along the lines of the world axis, the point of pivot for everything. And so the axis, the axle, the center, the sacred center, the middle point as it relates to the number 5, these things are all completely related to each other. And so this is where the king rules from. This is where the emperor rules from symbolically, from the center, from his center. In fact, in The King of the World, Rene Guénon literally says that emperor, lord, king symbolism is basically modeled after a northern polar king. He explicitly says that. And the idea was that they are holy and that they have this sort of divine aspect to them. And there's a whole entire metaphysical system associated with their rulership. And so a lot of kings wanted to rule from the center of their land, from the center of their empire. And this was supremely important to them for a bunch of different reasons. In part, by ruling from this central location, it related them to the quintessence, or to the fifth element, which is also known as ether. And so quin being related to the number 5, right? So there's a whole entire history, actually, of these emperors relating to the middle, relating to the center, relating to the number 5 in the middle of this great cross, right? The other thing about this cross, by the way, is that we divide the heavens into a cross, and that's common, right? And so there are a number of sky maps that divide the heavens into the cross, or you even look at the zodiac wheel and it's divided by a cross, right? And so we have the 4 royal stars, or we have the 4 seasons, we have the 4 elements, we have, the different sort of modalities, right? So we have cardinal, mutable, and fixed. And within each of those, we have 4 examples of that: 4 cardinal signs, 4 mutable signs, 4 fixed signs. And so by being in the middle, this symbolically represents, once again, that point of pivot for everything. And the king, the emperor, wanted to be the point of pivot for everything. For better or worse, my understanding is during the golden age, if such a thing ever existed, that there were actually righteous, benevolent kings. And they believed that they were basically there for the people, and they actually did a good job. It's almost hard for us to fathom that these days, that there are leaders or were leaders that actually treated their people with respect and didn't take advantage of them and things like that. Clearly, I think we have a lot of work to do in that regard, but it's interesting to think that there were emperors and kings that actually were righteous, and they had a whole entire metaphysical spiritual system that they were connected with, and it related them to the cross. It related them to their empire as it was divided into a cross. Oftentimes, from this central point, by the way, there was a north-south road and an east-west road. So the whole entire region was symbolically divided into 4 sections as well. It's my understanding that some older empires were actually structured as a gigantic square as well. So there's this natural relationship with the number 4. Once again, the 4 corners of the square, the 4 sides of the square. And there were 9 smaller squares that were gridded out within this large square. And the emperor wanted to occupy the central square because he believed that it was his divine right to be in the middle of the empire, and that the empire was going to be better off with him being in the sacred center of that land. And you'll see here that the center square is associated with the number 5, because the number 5 represents the middle of that vertical and horizontal axis. Once again, Rene Guénon talks about all of this symbolism, about the king or emperor or lord ruling from this central location, and how the empire was actually better off for it. That this actually made a lot of sense. If you had a ruler, why would they be tucked in some random region or corner of the empire? It would make perfect sense that they would want to be in the middle, and that there were spiritual reasons for this as well. And so China, actually, interestingly enough, was once referred to as the Middle Empire. And the Middle Empire refers to a number of things, but it also refers to this location from where the emperor of this empire is actually located. So what's really interesting is there's a number of towns all over the world where when you translate the name, it literally means middle, or it means center, because at one point in time, it was the center. And this whole entire science, by the way, is called centrography, that ancient peoples wanted to know the center of their land. They wanted to know the center of their place. And this was considered the Holy of Holies. This was considered to be the pilgrimage location from where their people came from. And so oftentimes the center of their island, as an example, would have a temple, or this would be the symbolic location that everyone would congregate to, or that there would be a castle or something along these lines, right? And so this is a whole entire thing. Once again, all of the books that I mentioned earlier really get into this history. But here's just a few names of cities around Europe that literally translate to middle or translate to center. And once again, it wasn't uncommon for this center to have a symbolic totem. In this case, I'll be talking about the standing stone or the stone in general. So here's a standing stone. No doubt, if this is a real old standing stone, this was the center of a region, right? And so people would congregate there. This would be like the gods congregating around the world tree, as an example. This would be the point of pivot for the whole entire empire. No doubt the emperor or the king would have a special relationship with this central location. Or in the case of some of these Eastern empires, it's in the middle where the king would actually dwell, where the emperor would actually live, right? And this gets into a whole entire deep rabbit hole about stones that exist in the middle of these places, these sacred stones. These stones were sometimes referred to as the stone of portions because it divided the land into 4 different sections. The dividing stone for the same reason, or the stone of divisions, because it literally separated the quarters, right? It separated east from west. It separated north from south. And so basically, it relates to the number 4. It relates to this large cross that the land was divided by. In this case, what we're looking at is actually the omphalos stone, which is Greek. And so there's a number of versions of the omphalos stone, but omphalos basically means navel, which means that it means center, essentially. And so there's a number of different types of stones around the world that basically served the same function as the stone of portions or the dividing stone. The cubic stone is another type of stone that basically embodies the exact same symbolism. And so this is the cubic stone from Freemasonry. It's really interesting because the cubic stone, or the cube itself, also strongly relates to the emperor, as we'll see right now. This is the Lon Milo Duquette deck, and you'll see that literally the emperor is chiseled out of stone, and his throne itself is a cubic stone. Isn't that interesting? It's actually a tradition to relate the emperor to this cubic stone, and specifically to relate it to his throne. It's fascinating to me because I've been talking about the cross, I've been talking about the square, but the 3D version of the square literally would be the cube itself. So here is the emperor once again on a cube, right? So this relationship has existed for a number of years now. This is the Marty Yeager deck. So here's the Tarot of the Third Millennium, and you can see here that he is sitting on a cube as well. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that the cube symbolically represents the center of all that is. And in that way, it's no different than the standing stone. It's no different than the omphalos stone, right? It's no different than the Kaaba cube. And wouldn't you know it, the Kaaba cube is at the sacred center of Islam. So as I mentioned, these sacred centers were once pilgrimage locations. So they were considered the location literally at the center of the world for their people. And so there's no more powerful or potent place on earth than people of this faith would want to travel to. So to go on this pilgrimage is to go on your Hajj. And this is considered to be the 5th pillar of Islam. Isn't that mind-blowing? The 5th pillar of all of the numbers, of all the pillars that it could represent, it represents the 5th pillar. Because once again, this location being at the center of the world, for these people at least, from their perspective, this is the true point of ascension. The center of the cross represents crossing over because it represents the center of all things. It represents the axis that is the bridge between heaven and earth, which if you've been watching these shows, you'll know that I've gone on about, in several episodes, but specifically the magician episode, because it's when you get to the center of self or the center of earth, you are communing with the center of the cosmos. There's a golden thread, or there's a ladder or a pillar, in this case, the 5th pillar, that literally binds all that is above with all that is below. So going to the center of any location represents this. And so even in a ritual space, right, like in Freemasonry, their lodge, their temple within the lodge, they consider to be the cosmos itself. And there's so many different examples of this. That's really what you want in your ritual space. You are declaring that this is the center of all that is, because you want to tap in to that sacred bridge that connects all that is above with all that is below. And for people in Islam, the Kaaba cube represents that. It's literally the Holy of Holies that everything revolves around. So what people do is they go to the Kaaba and they circumambulate it 7 times. They go counterclockwise 7 times because they are treating the Kaaba cube literally as an axle. They're treating it literally as a pole. But the cube is also interesting because it encodes the 6 directions of physical 3D space: up, down, left, right, forward, and backwards. And so in one way, the cube is the center of everything. Symbolically, it could be that central totem, that central pole, that point of pivot, but it also represents the totality of space as well. So it represents the middle of the cosmos, but because it represents 3D space, it represents the cosmos also as a whole. So there's a micro-macro dynamic with the cube as well. So here are the 6 directions, but what we're really looking at are the X, Y, and Z axis. So the X and Y axis exists on the horizontal plane, but it's the Z axis that transcends. It's the Z axis that symbolically connects the above and the below. And notice that the Z axis is emanating from the middle of the cross of the X and Y axis. So hopefully that makes everything a little bit more clear for you guys. But it's the middle of the cross that represents the point of transcendence. It's the middle of the cross where the polar mountain or the central mountain exists. And when you look at the Emperor card from the Rider-Waite deck, he is symbolically embodying the central mountain. You see those 2 mountains to the side of him? He is the central mountain. So he is the world mountain. He is the polar mountain. He is the middle of all that is, right? That's what he embodies. That's what he's aspiring to. This is what his life amounts to, essentially. He is the point of pivot for his empire. He's the point from which the 4 rivers or the 4 winds emanate. So when you look at his shoulders and then when you look at his helmet, does he not look like a central mountain in the middle of the 4 directions, north, south, east, and west? The point in the middle that once again the Z axis ascends from. So I think it's fascinating that he relates to the central mountain, the world mountain. And when we look at mountain symbolism, to me now, I immediately think of the pyramid. And I think it's fascinating that pyramids used to be looked at as pillars, essentially. So the Great Pyramid was once referred to as the Pillar of Enoch. And so pillar symbolism, once again, it just bridges the gap between heaven and earth. That's what the pyramid represents as well. It bridges the gap between heaven and earth. In fact, that's what we all represent as people. There's a great triune relationship between heaven, earth, and man. The Emperor really embodies this. The Hierophant has a lot of symbolism that relates to this as well, which we'll be getting into in the next episode. But the word pyramid is more of a modern word, but I think it's fascinating that it looks like a mountain. Symbolically, mountains relate to pillars and pyramids relate to pillars. But pyramid has ram right there in the middle. Pyramid. Ram is right there in the middle, and the Emperor relates to the ram. The most iconic feature of the ram, once again, are its horns. And so there is a headstrong sort of nature to the ram. There's a headstrong nature to the Emperor. You want that in your Emperor. You want that in your leadership, right? Also, rams are amazing climbers. So they ascend. They live at very high elevations. So literally, their climbing prowess is like nearly unmatched, right? I think of the goat and the ram. They're really hard to hunt for this reason because you have to go to very high elevations. So everything about the ram, everything about the emperor, it really has this sort of ascension dynamic built into it. And I see symbolism that relates to all of that with the pyramid itself. Also, it's probably worth mentioning that the pyramid has four sides to it, right? So if you look at a pyramid from the top down, it's going to make what? A square. And the sacred center for the pyramid would be where? In the middle. Regarding the symbolism of the world mountain, Rene Guénon said, "It is the center. It is the orientation of the terrestrial world." Indeed, it is. And when we're talking about orientation, we come right back to the compass. Where are you located? Where is the north? Oh, the North Pole. There's a whole tradition, a whole history here of people saying that a world mountain exists there. And speaking of which, I mean, these are just a few examples, but sometimes this world mountain is referred to as Mount Meru or Mount Kaf, Mount Olympus, Mount Zion, Mount Alborz, and I don't know how to say this last one, but I'll give it my best attempt. Montsalvat, right? That's from the Grail tradition. And so mountain symbolism is nearly universal in that it gets you closer to God. Oftentimes it's considered to be a sacred center. And, for my money, I see that the emperor symbolically embodies this, and it's beautifully illustrated in the Rider-Waite version that way. I've been referring to it as the World Mountain or Polar Mountain, but you could also refer to this mountain as the Northern Mountain, the Primordial Mountain, the Blessed Mountain, the Mountain of the Saints, the Mountain of the Prophets, or Mount of the Heritage. That one actually is new to me. And so it goes by many, many titles, but when you hear of a mountain, a rather large mountain, the biggest mountain in a myth, they're referencing this same mountain that I've been referring to this whole entire time. But this would be the mountain symbolically that exists in the middle of everything that is. And now there's just substitutions for this mountain, right? So once again, it might be a stone. It might be a cube. The tree is very much related to all of this symbolism as well. So it might be a world tree. The world tree and world mountain have so much symbolism in common. It's actually pretty wild, but for obvious reasons, we're talking about the mountain today. So the last thing I wanted to talk about today was the Chinese character for king, which is Yang. And I got this from Rene Guénon, and he talks about it at length. I think it's really, really fascinating. When you look at this character, what do you see? You see 3 horizontal lines and then 1 vertical line. Essentially, what he says is that when you decode this character and why the character is designed as such, what it represents is the king unifying the realms above and below. The upper realm represents heaven. The lower realm represents earth. That vertical line represents the king. And isn't it interesting, between the upper line and the lower line, you have a cross. So how incredible is that in this character from the East, you also have the cross, and it relates to the king and the kingdom itself, right? So once again, kingdoms, kings, and crosses, there's a huge overlap between all of these different things. And what this really amounts to is the king being a true unifier. And that's my main point here, is the emperor is a unifier. That's his more primordial role. That is more so his ancient role. It's almost hard as modern people to kind of understand this, because I don't see leaders as unifiers. That's what they should do. That's what they should embody. But I don't see that as actually being the case. But there's something to be said about the ancient world and emperors and kings and lords actually fulfilling this function and role. Symbolically, they were the bridge between heaven and earth, but they were also the bridge between the people. They were the bridge between the different quarters of their land. And so they represented that sacred center that everything revolves around. And so when you look at a wheel as an example, the external circumference of the wheel relates to multiplicity, it relates to division, but it's the center of the wheel where the axis is. That is the most balanced part of the wheel. That's where the reconciliation of opposites occurs. So in their personal practice, this is my understanding, kings of old, emperors of old, wanted to go to their sacred center because they realized that it unified them with other centers of reality. All that is above and all that is below, essentially. That's how you commune with the different layers or levels of realms that we exist within. And so know thyself and you'll know the universe. That's the secret. It's by going within is how you know the universe. And so as they went within, this would actually make them a more suitable leader, essentially. And so I just find this all to be really interesting and fascinating, how it relates to the cross and Christ and, obviously how it relates to us as well, right? So there's a huge relationship here. As with every tarot card has a historic angle, an esoteric angle, but then also a deeply personal angle as well. So from my vantage point, there is a cross. I'm in the middle of the cross. There's a north, south, east, and west. Same thing with you. So I encourage you to kind of take some of this symbolism and see how it relates to your life and how the Emperor relates to who you are. And so that goes with every single card as well. So I think that's going to do it, guys. I think I got most of what I wanted off my chest out there. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this presentation and you got another understanding of the Emperor, how it relates to this central mountain, the polar mountain, all these different types of things. I will see you guys in a couple of weeks for another episode. This time we'll be covering the Hierophant card, and that'll do it. Take care. Thank you so much for watching my Symbolic Secrets episode here on the Emperor card. If you liked what you saw, there's plenty more where that came from. Here's the current list of all the episodes. To sign up, head on over to patreon.com/symbolic studies or symbolicstudies.com/secrets. Once again, a subscription is just $5 a month. I've also gotten into the routine of posting weekly updates every Friday. Every other week, I post something exclusive just for supporters. Without a doubt, this is the best way to keep up with everything Symbolic Studies has to offer. Also, in case you weren't aware, I am available for tarot readings, study sessions, and symbolic birth chart readings. I really love meeting you guys and talking symbolism. You can book a session on my site, or as always, you can text me at 503-893-4606 for more information. Lastly, some of you may not be aware, but I've been a graphic designer for 25 years. In fact, that's how I got into symbolism. I've designed everything from logos, album covers, book covers, websites, you name it. I've also worked with huge corporations and small independent businesses, and essentially everything in between. I've also designed and edited everything you've seen for Symbolic Studies. If you're interested in a potential collaboration, reach out and we'll set up a call. For all things Symbolic Studies, please visit symbolicstudies.com. Thanks.